Welcome, friends and comrades, to another book launch event, this time co-hosted by the Midwestern Marx Institute and our comrades over at the Critical Theory Workshop, Orinoco Tribune, and the Hampton Institute. Today we are honored to be discussing Professor Immanuel Ness's new marvelous book, Migration as Economic Imperialism, which has a very sick cover. We'll be posting the links to where you can purchase the book throughout the event, so make sure to grab your copy. Immanuel Ness is professor of political science at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York and senior research associate at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. He is the editor at the Journal of Labor and Society and the author of many great books, including Southern Insurgency, The Coming of the Global Working Class from 2015, Urban Revolt, State Power and the Rise of People's Movements in the Global South from 2017, and this year's Migration as Economic Imperialism, which we will be, of course, discussing today. We'll begin our event with a presentation from Professor Ness, followed by shorter presentations from Professor Danny Shaw, who is unfortunately having to deal with some New York flooding, but hopefully will be here by then. A presentation by Noah Krashevik, then one by myself, and finally, one by Edward Smith. And we will conclude with a roundtable discussion where the audience will have the opportunity to ask Manny and the panelists as many questions as they want. So without further ado, we'll be started right after this. Alrighty, gotta love that international, huh? Gets the blood flowing. Manny, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Carlos, and an honor as well to be here. And thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Well, you're free to start your presentation whenever you want.
Okay. Well, thank you, Carlos, and thank you to the Midwestern Marx Institute for having me here. I think the major objective is to recognize the significant aspects of the book, why the book was written in the first place, where it comes from, and what are the major points that need to be advanced with respect to understanding the relationship between the global capitalist neoliberal economy and migration. And so, one of us, we could say, well, what's the relationship between capitalism and migration? So this book deals with a history of the world, really, to some degree, since the end of the Second World War, when, as we all know, there was a great promise for independence for most of the world. Basically, we can say that independence occurred for most of the world between 1945 and 1980, with a few other examples. I would not count the Soviet Union as an independence period of anti-imperialist independence. And so, in a very profound way, major objectives of independence, political independence, economic independence, the idea of respect and recognition in a world has not come into fruition. It's something that we must conclude some 70 to 80 years subsequent to the end of the Second World War, that independence today, while there's political independence to some degree, although I would argue that's not even true too, that most of the world is under the thumb of neoliberal capitalism, which is produced by the West, the Western countries, the United States as the major advocate and actually enforcer of neoliberal capitalism. And so, since the end of the Second World War, Harry Truman, who dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, got the bright idea that he was going to engage in development, that these newly independent countries like Indonesia, where there was a major purge of somewhere between 500,000 and 3 million communists in the 1960s by the United States proxies, that the United States would embark in an effort to develop the rest of the world in the kind of tradition of the United States. Well, we all know that this did not come to fruition, but I wanted to say that, initially it was based on development aid and so forth, which was a pittance of the GDP of the United States and Western countries as well, that were very wealthy. And much of their wealth was a product of imperialism itself, 500 years of imperialism. And there was a succession of programs, but along with these programs, official development aid, various kinds of especially loans that placed countries into significant, enormous debt and actually undermined countries that were seeking, in some ways, a socialist path, that it was a strategy actually to compete against the Soviet Union and as well as China to a great degree, and I can give you examples if you like, and to ensure that the United States remains, as well as Western Europe and the rich countries of the world, remain in a position of dominance. And so for the last, I guess we went through a history of understanding this process. The last, say, between 1965 or 70 and 1985, there was so about 20 years, there was a proliferation of works that examined the global economy as one that was a capitalist economy. Wallerstein refers to it as a capitalist economy that is rooted in a project that developed out of Europe, I think to a large extent. I mean, we know that that's true based on the development of capitalism in various countries around the world and the resistance from working classes around the world. And when working classes resist to a great degree, that leads also to the export of capital to cheaper labor markets. And of course, this is a process that reaches an apogee under industrial capitalism around the late 19th century, early 20th century, and so forth, where the export of capital becomes the dominant way in which rich countries are able to maintain their wealth and actually expand their wealth. Lenin writes about this in his epic book on imperialism, The Highest Stage of Capitalism, on the export of capital from Germany, which exploits Russian workers and to a great extent, and leads to high levels of profitability for the German ruling classes. And so I think it's very important to recognize that there is a long history of imperialism that is intertwined with the notion of development. So there's a hypocrisy here. I'm sorry. That hypocrisy is the idea that through the exploitation of countries in what we used to call the third world, and I'll call it today the third world, where 80% of the world's population live, and most of them are working class people. All of them are working class except the ruling classes of those countries, which are basically comprador classes in most of those countries. But that you have the extraction of profit from these countries at the same time as the capitalist countries are saying, the developed capitalist countries are saying that, we're helping you, we're developing your economies, we're giving you all these loans so that you can build, essentially more efficient ways to produce coffee or cocoa or bananas or palladium or platinum or gold, etc. So essentially the extraction of commodities, agricultural commodities, natural resources, and most recently the extraction of surplus value from workers themselves, because we have this misnomer in the West that is propagated by many Marxists or socialists of different stripes who argue that the working class has come to an end, which is you'll find in virtually every generation. There are proponents of this. Most recently, Nick Skierniczek has put forward that idea that we don't have a working class that's necessary anymore, that technology and digitization will change it. But of course, we have examples from previous eras of those who call themselves Marxists or socialists of one kind or another, who say, well, the working class has come to an end. We don't really need them anymore. But the point I wanted to make is that today there are more manufacturing workers than at any time in the history of the world. And those manufacturing workers are primarily in the global south and are highly exploited, including places like China. Now, that's another question which we can discuss perhaps later, because I think that China is moving towards socialism. But so anyway, so there were examples of development aid, giving money to, I remember, in the 80s and 90s, these food aid programs. Some of you might, I think they still have those food aid programs. Let's help the poor people who are, it's highly insulting, the poor people who are dying because they don't have enough food. The reason why they don't have enough food is because the US dollar and the European currencies, the euro, et cetera, are so strong that they aren't able to even purchase goods. And their societies have not developed for the most part. And I can give examples if people are interested. And this book actually provides a number of examples of countries that just don't develop. One example would be Nepal, which is a very important case where there was a revolution in the 1990s, a Maoist revolution that did not come to fruition. It was partially successful, but did not transform the nature of the capitalist state. The country is essentially a place where the rich of the world go to ski or to go to climb the mountains and so forth. They're basically tour operations. That's their major kind of economic activity. You go to Kathmandu. It's a city with maybe one street light with several million people living in there. I'm not exaggerating. I mean, I was just recently there, where you have earthquakes that devastate the society, that tens of thousands die, and there's really nothing that is done. And so the West had the bright idea, the United States, especially with the support of the international agencies, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, but also especially finance capital. I mean, one thing that we cannot deny, and this goes back to Lenin again, finance capital is pushing forward efforts to advance surplus value through extraction of profits from labor. And within the context of Nepal, which is always good to give an example of what's going on, we're looking at a society which, depending on which year, is one of the poorest, or was the poorest country in the world. Now I think it's Burundi, but Niger and countries like that, Malawi. And many of these countries are actually migrant export states, which is an interesting point, because the story of development, the idea of development, which is a huge area of research in the academy. Everybody has, an idea of how to develop a society, but they're all based on capitalist principles of how do we industrialize and extract profits from this industry. Although, again, we can't deny the fact that industrialization has its limits on the planet that is warming at a rapid pace. I don't want to go so far afield. I want to focus on Nepal. So we have a country, Nepal, which is a fairly small country in area, and yet has a population of close to 50 million people, which is larger than Canada. And most of the population lives in poverty. And their major industry today is migration, without question. Their agricultural sector is producing for some people in the rural areas, but migration is a major industry. So if you go to Kathmandu, you'll see companies from throughout the world who are recruiting workers to be employed chiefly in manufacturing industries, which is very interesting because you don't really think of migrants, although maybe in the Midwest you do, as working in manufacturing. I mean, certainly in the Midwest you do, especially the packing house industries. So, and that's another dynamic that's happening as we saw over the last 20 years, Postville, Iowa, et cetera. So we have in Nepal, and so they're exporting workers to be employed, actually mostly not in the global north, in the global south. Because once again, it is based on the notion of the Marxist notion, which I think really reaches an apogee in volume 3 of Capital, of the extraction of surplus value, the development of capitalism in rural areas and so forth. And Nepal is a perfect example of that, where the country is primarily a rural country with no development, period. And then, so you have this city, and you see a lot of recruitment agencies. You see a lot of quote unquote training agencies and so forth. It's referred to as a migration infrastructure. So these are the, kind of industries that are parasitic, that seek to extract profits from labor, in this case, migrant laborers and their families, through charging fees for various things, including getting them visas, sending them on flights. Many of these workers are put into tremendous amounts of debt. And by the way, we're talking about men and women. Half the migrants, and we're talking about workers, half the migrant workers in the world are women and half of them are men. And that's something that is a very recent dynamic. And it shows you how powerful capitalism is and imperialism is at the same time in just completely disrupting the normal flow of life in many of these societies. So in any case, Nepal has not developed. It remains a marginalized society on the fringes of the world. They don't have decent roads. They don't have decent health care. Life expectancy is fairly low. Of course, there are differentials in that population. One can go to Africa and make the case even to a greater extent, where life expectancy might be 40 years. So, people don't have access to education, housing, and so forth. And those people who leave the country, the ones that are recruited, happen to be in the age groups of between 18 years of age in the Western sense. I say Western because we start counting age in the second year of life. So anywhere between 18 and 25 or so. And after that, basically, they become redundant laborers. Maybe 30 if you push it in certain parts of the world, if people have skills. So I'm referring primarily to working class people who are primarily from rural areas, who are exported by their countries to the global south, to parts of the global south and the global north. Now with the Brexit, in the post-Brexit era, the United Kingdom is getting into the act of recruiting Nepalese workers. In this case, workers who are in the fishery industry, and they're highly exploited. What I mean by exploitation is that they get a fraction of the wages that the local population does, because why have migrant workers if the local population, if they're getting the same wages? Well, there is some reason to have them. And I'd also like to point out the fact that migrant workers are necessary for the West. I say necessary, and for the West, but I don't think they're necessary for the South. So they're necessary for the northern countries that are rich, that are trying to extract surplus value, that have a shortage of nurses, that have a shortage of engineers, that have a shortage of technicians and so forth and so on, many different industries, IT workers. We can get into that discussion if you'd like. But I think principally, medical and healthcare industries, that's one of the major areas of migration of women, care work. And most of that labor goes to the global north, where, these essential populations in the prime of their life, when I think of prime of life, I got to be honest with you guys. I think the prime of one's life, I think I missed it, but is between the ages of 18 and 30, maybe, where you're supposed to have fun and enjoy things and experiment with what you want to do in your life, and kind of find out what you really enjoy and what you want to pursue. I mean, it's a kind, we go to universities in this country and so forth, and kind of explore what we are interested in. I happen to be interested in imperialism and socialism. I can give you that origin at another time, but I would argue actually in United States universities and Western universities, we don't learn about socialism, nor do we learn about imperialism. And just getting back again to the question of imperialism, since about 2000, with the incredible work of Samir Amin, and before that, Argyri Immanuel, the two, I think, iconic figures, along with Andre Gunder Frank, who understood dependency theory to a great degree, and came up with, I would argue, perspectives and conceptual analyses that substantiate and quantify and qualify the reasons why there is inequality on a global basis. And one that actually is recognized by most honest Western, even capitalist scholars. What I said, I'll give you an example. Some of you might have heard of the economist Branko Milanovic. He was the head economist at the World Bank for many years, obviously from former Yugoslavia, maybe Serbia, I think. And he acknowledges all these questions, these problems, the inequality that exists on a global level. And he sees it as a major danger to the future of capitalism as well. Of course, we have great differences with amongst each other. He's not a communist. He's not a socialist. He doesn't believe in equality. He doesn't believe in class struggles in the global north, which I think is certainly a very important element of the economies of the global north, where there are large and growing numbers of workers that are falling into poverty and can't pay their bills for housing and so forth. And where women are subordinated to a great extent, as well as other marginalized groups. I'm not interested in identity politics, but we have to recognize those groups that are subordinated in different ways because of who they are and not necessarily of what they can do. So getting back to the imperialist argument, the new model for economic development is exporting your workers. So exporting your educated, highly skilled workers, the STEM industry, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, as well as exporting the low-wage workers, which make up the vast majority of labor. And the thing is that, at this point in time, even under the COVID, in the COVID era, the number of migrant workers had grown. And today I would argue, estimate, I would say, that about $1 trillion of remittances are produced by migrant workers. So we ask ourselves, well, where does that money go and who's earning that money? Well, most of the remittances are earned by people who are business people and in the STEM industries, and they come back home and they exploit their own workers. I mean, I wanted to cite from a passage, if you don't mind, on page 155 from this book, and the passage actually comes from Marx's Capital, volume 3. If you don't mind, I just want to say, I want to put this forward, because capitalism and its expansion produces poverty and creates levels of oppression that are integral to the system itself. So notwithstanding who people are and so forth, and it is something that develops. So I'm just going to very briefly read this slowly, but I think it's very clear. So Marx writes, in reality, the mobility of capital creates means by which to overcome obstacles that spring from the nature of production itself, and on the other hand, with the development of the mode of production peculiar to itself, it eliminates all the legal and extra economic impediments to its freedom of movement in the different spheres of production. Above all, it overturns all the legal or traditional barriers that would prevent, sorry about that. I have to turn certain things off, sorry. Okay.
No problem. I think that was just you seeing Danny come along anyway. So
that was seeing Danny come on, who's a comrade, and all of you are as well. Here's the key point that I wanted to make. Although labor power assumes a distinctive form in every particular sphere of production, it remains true that the flexibility of capital, its indifference to the particular forms of the labor process it acquires, is extended by capital to the worker. Now, by this, Marx is really arguing that many of the migrant workers may come back and exploit the local populations. And so if we go to the universities, the arguments that in political science and sociology, etc., the argument is that the fact that remittances are given to migrant workers and they're sent home, it undermines states, because workers in the global south don't know anything about democracy, according to them, and that this is a good way to overthrow authoritarian governments. You notice I won't, the United States regime says that, so I'm just turning it on its head. So in other words, the imperialism, so there is a critical relationship between imperialism and migration, where especially the effort is to undermine socialist countries through migration, where projects that are developing increasingly, actually, in some parts of the world, are undermined by efforts to export workers. I mean, I can give a number of other examples of, and I'd like to go on, but I also wanted to put forward the concept of cultural imperialism, the idea that somehow Western and Northern customs and ways of life are better than those of the South, that are more meaningful and more advanced and so forth. This is part of the migration theoretical understandings. People like Peggy Levitt advances this notion that I guess about 10, 20 years ago, the idea of human capital came into existence, which I think is bogus, so that she uses the term cultural capital. So in the sense that Dominican workers who come to the United States go back and they take new and better cultures to their countries. I think that's cultural imperialism. It's probably the epitome of cultural imperialism. But I think the major, the major factor that this book tries to advance is that the new form of development that is being advanced is one that actually undermines the development of countries. There are numerous examples that I've seen and I've studied throughout the world, just about everywhere in the world, where you have migration and people come back and their lives are in many ways ruined, especially women's lives, who, we still have patriarchy on a global scale, and women are dispensed with because they're considered to be, having left the family and so forth. They're considered to have failed their families in some ways. People come back to their countries indebted. During the COVID crisis, the COVID pandemic, there was something that we had in the United States and we'll still have. It's called wage theft. In this case, it was even worse because many of the employers in countries of destination did not pay their migrant workers and sent them home as quickly as possible. So there's high levels of exploitation and so forth. There's absolutely no evidence of development, no new hospitals, no new roads, or let's say health clinics even, maybe a few of them. The undermining of societies such as El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala in Central America. Before that, Mexico to a great extent. And then we can also look even in Eastern Europe, countries like Moldova, where more than half the population live outside the country. Another example would be Lebanon, and so forth and so on. The book also deals with the mistreatment and the oppression of migrants in their destination states, and how employers treat them in an incredibly abusive way. I spoke about that in terms of extraction, but I don't want to be extraction of capital, of surplus value, but I want to be, I met many of these workers who were desperate to go home and didn't have enough money for the bus trip home. People who hadn't seen their family in years, who completely forgot about their families and have not remitted money back to their homes and so forth. But I see this all as a project of imperialism, a capitalist imperialism that is highly oppressive, and one in which is based on the inequality of exchange in the world, so that workers in the global south produce and create surplus value, but that surplus value is estimated. It's considered to be far less valuable than the kind of surplus that's produced in the major advanced capitalist countries. So this is the contribution of Immanuel's work, Unequal Exchange, and we're seeing now a revitalization of unequal exchange in amongst students and amongst activists who are very much interested in seeing how and trying to stop this from happening. It's going to be a long project, obviously. The fact that there's an unequal exchange of trade, so that when goods are traded, they have different values based on where in the world that good is produced. Those goods are produced. I mean, we could, the best example of that, people don't attribute this work to Immanuel, but he was the founder of it, is the iPhone, right? The iPhone, which emerges from the minds of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then in other countries in Africa, and then are produced in China. I think a number of scholars have argued that the amount of value that China is able to extract from the Chinese workers and China as a whole is $10 per phone. Maybe it's more, or maybe it's less today. And then it's sold to countries primarily in the West. That's the example that many people know about. John Smith has written about this in his work on imperialism in the 21st century, but so many other writers have, as well as Donald Cleland. I don't know if people know his work. He's a great Marxist who died recently, who refers to this process as a extreme form of oppression. It's almost like the iceberg concept, where you see the tip of the iceberg in the water, but you don't see what's underneath it. So we only see the kind of fetishized product, but we don't see what actually produced it. Anyway, I think I've gone over time, and I would like to give it up to others. So, and I'm happy to go more if you want me to, but I think it's only right to allow you to comment and criticize, whatever.
No, that was excellent, Manny. It was really, really good. I took a lot of notes, and I'll bring those up in the discussion portion of the event. But it's great to see you, Danny. Danny was listed as our first speaker of the day. So you're free to start whenever you'd like.
Good to see everybody. Yeah, the weather in New York City the past 24 hours has been interesting. So I was listening in bumper to bumper traffic in the Bronx. Everyone should know that Manny's not just a scholar, but a true anti-imperialist who's in the streets, who stood in the streets in defense of Libya when they were under the gun, when NATO and the U.S. were bombs away. He stood in solidarity with the most oppressed. We live in a country where these issues that really shouldn't be controversial on the left continue to be controversial. And I've known Manny for a while and followed his work both in the academy and in the streets. And he's always been on the right side of the class barricade. So it's an honor to read his work, to review his work. And I was taking notes as well. A few things that stood out to me from the book. I haven't finished it yet, but the chapters that I've read. When I was reading about Nepal, it took me to the Dominican Republic. When I was reading about the Dominican Republic, it took me to Haiti. There's so many different connections here. We know that the slogan, same struggle, same enemy, is more relevant than ever. And when we think about these incredibly rich countries and the fact that they're more dependent than ever think that a country as rich as Caribbean countries and South American countries, African countries, Middle Eastern countries have to continue to depend on economic forms of development, which are not development, they're underdevelopment, particularly tourism. When we look at tourism in Brazil, in the Dominican Republic, in Cancun, and across the global South, they try to sell the idea to people here in the North and in the global South that it's developing the Dominican economy or the Thai economy. But it's predatory transnational capital that cashes in on the tourist industry, leaving local workers to collect a few crumbs if they're lucky. So how can we build a type of tourism that's more about solidarity tourism? We've seen different experiments with ecological tourism, because the relationship between a typical tourist and somebody in the exploited periphery is not a relationship of equality. It hurts any of us who truly believes in a world based on justice. And to see the currencies of different countries continually devalued, and then the IMF and the World Bank and these finance organizations try to justify that's attracting foreign capital, and how Manny's analysis turns this on its head. How could it ever be positive for the Mexican people to be told that their peso is worth but 1/17th of the US dollar? How could you tell the Dominican workers that 54 Dominican pesos equals $1 that this is somehow a good thing for them? And we can go across the board. How do they weaponize the devaluation of our currencies? How do they weaponize inflation? So our prognosis for the future is, to quote Rosa Luxemburg, some a century plus after her assassination in Berlin in 1919, this is a showdown between capitalism and barbarism. We have no choice but to fight back and nationalize and socialize these different economies so they can correspond and respond to people's everyday needs. And here in New York City, the #1 immigrant group now is from the Dominican Republic. And for me, having lived in DR for part of my life, to see Dominican youth, and this goes to what Manny was talking about with cultural imperialism, to see a whole generation, in the generation of my two sons, and then my generation, when I lived there, most young people, their dream is not to stay in the Dominican Republic and try to improve their country. Their dream is to somehow get to New York City, to somehow flee their homeland. And American dreaming is arguably the #1 drug that so many of us are addicted to. And how important to ask, where's the Dominican dream? Where is the Salvadorian dream? Where is the Mexican dream? And to what Manny's book does is it shows how the US dream, the American dream, is predicated on top of really a global nightmare, the negation of all of these different national dreams. So in New York City, we see this on a daily basis. We see workers who dream of going back to their homelands. How many of our friends, comrades, family members lose a loved one in Brazil or in Peru, and they don't even have the quote unquote paperwork or visa or passport to travel back home to bury their family members and mourn properly. So imperialism manifests in a million different ways. One of the last points I'll make about cultural imperialism, I taught in Nicaragua in 2005 when Telesur was founded by the Venezuelans, the Cubans, the Uruguayans, and the Argentinians at the time. The Uruguayans, the government then went right wing, and they no longer helped produce Telesur. At that time in 2005, RT and Hispan TV and the different anti-imperialist channels of the global South, and in the case of RT from Russia, certainly part of the pluripolar world as we see this showdown playing out in Ukraine with this proxy war against Russia. But at that time, 90% of all images, of all news shared in the world, whether it was print journalism, audiovisual, 90% came from Japan, the European Union, and the United States. We no longer live in that world 18 years later. We no longer have to talk about when there'll be a multipolar world. We are witnessing, and more importantly, we are participating in the construction of a multipolar world. Every time that Iran finds a way to trade with Venezuela, every time the Venezuelan leadership can make it to Beijing, every time Beijing can trade with Russia, as the Cubans say, if it wasn't for the Russians, we'd be starving right now. So we have to appreciate the dialectical nature of these different systems. We're not saying, of course, that the Russian economy is what the Soviet economy was, but to the extent that the Russians exist and can provide an alternative to the Venezuelans and the other blockaded countries, this is an amazing thing. So shout out to Manny, shout out to Telesur, shout out to all of the alternative media that is confronting cultural imperialism on a day-to-day basis. I think we're growing more and more confident, more and more emboldened. There's more communication. There's more resistance that is truly globalized. And I think that's why we have a certain revolutionary optimism. And I think those are the conclusions that I'll hopefully get to in Manny's book. Because clearly capitalism, white supremacy, and imperialism have failed humanity. And that's why they spend so much time vilifying and demonizing China and Vietnam and any alternative economic project. And then they try to go and tell the Africans that the Chinese are the potential predators, and they try to say that the Russians are the enemy that they should be afraid of. And the Africans know history all too well, and they know that it's never been the Chinese or the Russians that have pillaged their lands and cashed in on the surplus value of their populations, that it was always the Western countries, today the US and their junior partners in England and in France and across Europe. So thanks again to Manny for his work. This is truly an example of a scholar who's shoulder to shoulder with the masses of the global South in their march to overcome imperialism.
Beautifully said, brother. That was excellent. Noah, you're up next.
Yeah, that's hard to follow. Hi, everybody. I gotta say, honestly, like, I'm always kind of intimidated when I do presentations with the kind of people we have here tonight. Honestly, I mean, Danny's brilliant, Carlos is brilliant, Eddie is brilliant, Manny is brilliant. These are brilliant people, the kind of people who get paid to teach other people, right? Who am I compared to that? You know what I mean? I don't have any fancy degrees, and frankly, I hated school. You know, I only begrudgingly graduated. I'm just a guy who fixes rich people's houses all day. You know, I'm a working Joe or a working Noah or whatever. But I'm also a guy who thinks about things, right? Even this short presentation, I sat down and thought about it for a long time before I even put a word down on a page. And quick story, Carlos sent me a copy of the book a while back, right? And I'd planned to skim it in the morning before work. That's when I do all of my reading. Before I knew it, 3 hours had passed, and I was rushing out the door because I was late. And so I was thinking about this book that had so captured my attention all day while I was at work, right? And it hits me as I'm talking to a coworker at lunch. This isn't just a good anti-imperialist book. I mean, it is a good book. It is an anti-imperialist book, but it's a good anti-imperialist book specifically for me, or for people like me anyway. It's an academic text, but it's not written like an academic text. It flows, you know, the language and not just the citations were obviously given a lot of care when it was being written. But beyond that, it's chock full of facts that, you know, Manny was just going over. excuse me, not just any facts, right? Facts that matter in the vitally important struggles of our era specifically. Gramsci had this concept he called the war of positions and war of maneuvers, right? I'm sure everyone here knows all about these, but in the conditions of the USA in 2023, in this declining era of empire, the proliferation of internet communication, and the working class losing just about all the faith it ever had in the state, media, and other institutions of the ruling class. That war of positions isn't just the primary area of struggle over that of maneuvers, but it's also winnable. And to win it, we need to understand the moves of our opponents. We need to understand the entire sort of battlefield, right? We need to be able to deconstruct their theories and narratives, expose them for what they actually are in the real world, and then put the pieces back together in a way that can take the kernels of insight that all working class people have due to the social consciousness created by being working class, and then point them at the solutions to the problems the ruling class created. Excuse me. So that's when I decided what, woefully underqualified me could add here, right? This book is important because agitation and education come first before organization. Nobody is going to listen to you if you don't know what you're talking about. And if you want to wage a war of positions in the USA in 2023, you need to know about the relationship between our national contradictions and international contradictions, the relationships and processes of imperialism in its neoliberal decaying stage. I work in the trades in the Midwest, right? And let me tell you, all the various discourse topics, all the issues people tell us are pressing, none of them matter compared to one thing. How are we going to get by? Prices are increasing and wages are decreasing. Now, I know I said I hated school, but I did learn enough to understand that math don't add up, right? That's beside the point, though. One of the major excuses our ruling class gives us as to why wages cannot keep up with the vastly inflated price of things, like all the things we need to buy just in order to survive, is mass migration, right? Or mass immigration. This narrative is a huge, huge barrier, if not the biggest barrier, to getting people into class consciousness. If we don't see working people from everywhere as more similar to us than the boss, then we're still siding with the boss, And just telling people it's the boss that has all the power over what wages we make, don't cut it. It just don't. We all remember Trump's wall, right? People believe that kind of thing. They still believe that kind of thing. I talk to my coworkers about this kind of stuff all the time. And one of the biggest obstacles I run into is that the media machine sort of trains people to expect and then dismiss the counter narrative. I mean, it builds the entire counter narrative itself too. The answer is stop all immigration or open borders, right? Do we want everyone to come here or no one to come here? Are the illegals pouring across the borders and into Ohio to dance with our sisters, vote for Democrats to lower our wages? Or are they doing so to enrich our social atmosphere and culture while embracing the wonderful progressive values of the ruling class and must be tokenized and stripped of all agency? Which is it, right? This is what people are spoon-fed by the media machine 24/7. As Manny was saying in his presentation, imperialism depends upon migration, right? Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second, but it depends on this migration for its existence in its current form. None of the views presented in the media address this. All of them take imperialism as a given, and none of them ask the question, why do we have these issues in the first place? And that's what migration as economic imperialism does. It answers that question in detail for us. And while it does that, It shines a light on all the false narratives we're given about how actually giant Western financial conglomerates owning everything in countries of the tricontinent is not just good for those conglomerates, but good for the working class in both the Western countries and the global South. Like Mr. Ness tells us right in the intro, the orthodoxy of the so-called economists in our bourgeois institutions centers on a belief that, quote, migrant laborers benefit poor and rich countries through providing jobs for low-wage workers from southern countries, supplying necessary labor for destination states in the global north, and contributing to the economic development in poor countries. But if that's the case, why are those countries not developing, and why is our country deteriorating? Again, that math just don't add up. In his chapter on labor, migration, and destination states, Manny tells us precisely why that is, right? Walking us through the process and its effects step by step, like he does for just about every other corner of the subject. But this section, this is what made me think about the importance of a book in our country, in the belly of the beast, as they call it, right? Because it's not enough to take a moral stand against the horrors inflicted on people that we don't know, right? It's just not enough for a lot of people. People need to know the facts. To quote this section, right? Since the end of the Second World War, capital and corporations have benefited from the movement of workers across national boundaries, which not only lowers costs, but creates social divisions, which can be deployed to undermine existing labor standards among all workers. However, such movement also offers an opportunity to galvanize cross-national demands to reduce economic insecurity. This is the old divide and conquer trick in action. And really, the information in this section and the rest of the book serves to verify and to prove to people when used in conversation, like I did at lunch with my coworker the day I had this sort of idea, the lessons Marx taught us about the basic contradictions between workers and owners, the reflection of the contradictions of production itself. What's good for migrant workers is good for workers in the destination country and vice versa. Gus Hall said something in an essay in 1970 that he wrote that stuck with me just always. I use the quote all the time because it applies all the time. He said, people do not respond to commands or exhortations. They do not respond to ideas, even good ideas, unless they see their self-interest reflected in those ideas. And Mr. Ness's book isn't just a good idea. It gives all the pertinent information to back up the good idea and prove to anyone listening or anyone reading, and I strongly recommend reading, that their self-interest is in the international struggle against the corporations and against capital. That's it for me. Lastly, I just want to say I'm a carpenter, so to me, everything is sort of a tool of some sort. So Manny, thank you very much for just another essential tool that I plan to use frequently.
Awesome. Great job, Noah. That was a great presentation. Clearly you learned something from school because that was awesome. So next up, we got Carlos El Garrido.
Thank you. It's going to be hard to follow those two great presentations. And I, in many ways, took a similar course in my presentation to Noah. We were talking with Manny before about some of the essential contributions that this book provides. And that's one of the things that I want to focus on here, because there's one of them that I think Manny's selling himself short on. Because it is in many ways a book that provides almost like the archetype of what ideological critique ought to be from the perspective of Marxism. And it's just completely overturning these narratives that get reality and flip it on its head in order to justify the existing order. But without further ado, I'll start my presentation now. The traditional Marxist critique of ideology has understood both the functional and epistemological dimensions of bourgeois ideologies' claims. This tradition has always emphasized how ideas are both conditioned by the historical conjunctures and class positions of the people and institutions that materially embody them, but also, and equally as important, how under class societies, the economically dominant class in whose control the rest of the political, juridical, and ideological institutions are, has to necessarily distort the world's understanding of itself so that the vast majority of people whose class interests are diametrically opposed to theirs can consent to this topsy-turvy image of the world. As Marx and Engels noted early in their theoretical development, if in all ideology men and their circumstances appear upside down, as in a camera obscura, this phenomenon arises just as much from their historical life process as the inversion of objects on the retina does from their physical life processes. This structurally necessary ideological inversion will later be labeled by Engels false consciousness, a condition where the people are unaware of the real driving forces which move them, instead imagining false or apparent driving forces. This prevents bourgeois ideologues from properly understanding the world. It subdues their ability to obtain truth in their work. However, this is far from being only a question of errors in thinking. That is, the problem of ideological false consciousness, contrary to popular belief and those of the postmodernized Western Marxist specialists, is far from being merely one of consciousness. The inverted character of ideologues' ideas is a reflection of an objective social order that requires its inhabitants to think of it in deliberately inverted ways. In short, the error in thinking is an objective necessity for our social order, a social order that requires the generalization of mistaken views of itself for its own reproduction. The conventional bourgeois imperialist narratives on migration and migrant labor, a phenomenon which affects around 3 billion people, approximately 40% of the global population, is filled with these ideological inversions. Immanuel Ness's book does an exceptional job at exposing how these ideas emerge out of the capitalist imperialist system and not out of some mythical, disinterested, and bias-free scientific observers. He shows us how these ideas distort reality, providing us with an upside-down image of the real world. And finally, he shows us who benefits, that is, what class and social system is upheld by the systematization of these ideological contortions. The book is, in short, a quintessential example of what Marxist scholars should be doing in the battle of ideas, exposing the hollow falsity of bourgeois narratives and replacing these with the truth, which, as we know well, is always on the side of the revolutionaries. And while this last point might seem swaggering, it is not our fault, as Che Guevara was often attributed to have said, that reality is Marxist. The conventional imperialist narrative on migrant workers holds that they benefit the global economy, the global north countries of destination, and the global south countries of origin. Through remittances and the skills migrant workers obtain in the global north, so the imperialist narrative goes, they can develop their countries of origin. Remittances are painted as, in the words of Manny, a leading form of economic development for poor countries by institutions such as the International Development Agencies, the World Bank, and other imperialist institutions. After the migration boom of the 1990s that followed the overthrow of the USSR, the increased flow of remittances led bourgeois specialists to hold that this was a far more preferable alternative to the old school foreign aid that kept poor countries dependent on rich ones. The system that devised mechanisms of debt trapping and structural adjustment programs that kept the global south countries poor and indebted, of course, was never questioned. But in addition to remittances, the conventional imperialist narrative held that a stratum of higher skilled migrant workers were capable of developing new skills in the global north. These skills, so the myth goes, are taken back to the origin country and used to fuel their development and fight poverty. Are these narratives true? Do they actually correspond to the reality that they attempt to explain? As you could have guessed it, they are about as true as any of the other capitalist myths, which means, from the standpoint of a comprehensive analysis of the world as it actually exists, these claims are not true at all. In fact, their conclusions turn reality upside down. As the Athenian oligarchs once wrongly accused Socrates of doing, they are the ones that make the worst appear the better cause. They make migration, which benefits almost exclusively the elites of the imperialist countries, appear as a beneficial phenomenon for those poor souls forced into it by the conditions their countries have been subjected to after centuries of imperialist plunder and colonial and neo-colonial domination. In reality, as Manny eloquently demonstrates, remittances do not improve the standard of living for most inhabitants living in poor countries and do contribute to economic imbalances which engender higher levels of crime and violence. Remittances themselves, Manny shows, contribute to the erosion of the agrarian sector in southern economies as they constitute a form of rent for many residents in origin countries who are dependent on the continuing flow of remittances, an extremely unreliable source of income. Additionally, even when certain migrant workers obtain new skills in the global north, many of them do not return home. Skilled migrant workers, as Manny shows, are more likely to be provided with legal status than low-wage workers. This leads to what some scholars have called a brain drain, the systematic flight of skilled workers, scientists, and technicians from their countries of origin in the global south, where they often got educated at, to the countries of the imperialist global north. However, even when these skilled workers do go back, Manny demonstrates that they often end up working in niche economies, which do not contribute to improving the lives of most residents there, but are directed to building networks with international businesses that benefit only a small fraction of elites, as the majority of inhabitants remained in mired poverty. So, for the imperialized countries of origin, where exactly are the benefits of migration? Besides the outliers and the elites that are benefited, the reality is that there are none. If migration were beneficial to developments in the countries of origin, as Manny notes, then countries with high migration would not be suffering the highest poverty rates, or would at least be seeing improvements that outstrip those of countries that were not following a migration development strategy. The evidence shows that the opposite of the conventional migration development paradigm is true. Migration helps to keep poor countries poor while enriching rich countries with a pool of cheap labor that they can super exploit. The 10 leading remittance receiving nations, Manny shows, are amongst the poorest states in the world. The primary dynamic of migration, Manny shows, is rooted in the political economy of imperialism, which subordinates poor regions of the global south. Contemporary migration is, therefore, a product and central component of today's imperialism. It provides for imperialist countries whose rates of profit with their national working class have been on a steady decline, a cheap pool of labor to super exploit. These workers, many undocumented, who are forced to break with their families by the hundreds of millions in search for jobs that pay them pennies on the dollar of the already exploited global north workers. They frequently take up the most dangerous jobs and are forced to do these under the most precarious conditions, with very little bargaining power. They're often recipients of xenophobic attacks and derogatory racist remarks, a phenomenon produced by the elites of the global north to convince their native workers, themselves struggling to get by, that their enemy is the migrant and not their own boss. An interesting paradox arises here. While migrant workers have become an indispensable component of the imperialist economies for which they provide a cheap pool of labor to super exploit, these same workers are treated with the utmost expendability, evidenced in their working conditions and racist treatment. This is a phenomenon that some scholars have called the dialectics of superfluity, where human life and labor becomes simultaneously indispensable and expendable for capitalism. It is a condition that, while general in the working class, is intensified in migrant workers and oppressed peoples. But things don't have to be this way. In fact, it is impossible for them to continue this way forever. The world and everything in it are in a constant state of flux, where all is interconnected to all, and contradiction functions as the engine of historical motion. These objective contradictions in the global capitalist imperialist economy contain the kernels for their own supersession. The interests of migrant workers and workers in the global north are the same. Both are fighting against the same global capitalist elite. It is the same elite that exploits and oppresses them both, even if it does not do it with the same intensity to each one. The interests of workers of all countries, migrant or not, are found in uniting with their class against the parasitical rulers of the world, those who destroy humanity in their pursuit of profit. As time passes and these contradictions intensify, we're seeing workers coming together to fight. We're seeing the embryonic development of class consciousness, and sooner or later, we will see in mass the moderate demands James Connolly heralded in 1907. We only want the earth. Thank you.
Nice. Great work, Carlos. That was awesome. I guess I'll jump right into my presentation then. Some people know that I have, I guess, the gift or the curse of brevity. Maybe that's just because social media has poisoned my brain, but I'll try and be brief here. First of all, I wanted to mention that a few years ago when we had just started Midwestern Marx, one of the very first articles we published was an article specific to Iowa about how migrant workers were being the first to be thrown back into the meatpacking plants, or who were not given COVID protections. And many of them died. And OSHA totally dropped the ball on protecting these migrant laborers in essential sections of the economy. So this is definitely something that hits home for us, and a topic that we've been interested in for a while. Also, at my high school, actually, when I was a senior, there was a sort of race riot that broke out in the cafeteria that was sparked by one of the farm kids yelling at a son of immigrant laborers, a racial slur. And it was almost like a microcosm of the broader rural economy taking place in that cafeteria there, where you had tons of immigrant laborers working on the farms, and then tons of xenophobia and racist remarks that were thrown at them by the native workers or by the farm owners exploiting their labor. So again, definitely a topic that hits close to home for us. Tons of migrant laborers in the Midwest. It's vital to the economy here, and vital to capitalist profits, of course. So in this text, Migration is Economic Imperialism, Mr. Ness critiques the neoliberal narrative that economic migration and free markets are the key to economic development and reducing poverty and unemployment. The analysis he provides is vitally important for Marxists in the 21st century, trying to understand the globalized, neoliberal, imperialist, capitalist mode of production that we're struggling against. Showing the role that migration plays in perpetuating the neoliberal world order by providing capitalists and wealthy imperialist countries with cheap exploitative labor, which is why the IMF and Western multinational corporations have been promoting migration in the global South since the 1990s. Ness gives a far more comprehensive view of economic migration than what is given by his neoliberal contemporaries, seeing migration as one element within the broader capitalist mode of production, and showing that while remittances sent back to poorer countries by migrant laborers in richer countries may help certain individuals get food and pay rent, they ultimately serve to profit multinational corporations and rich companies, and maintaining the existing state of global inequality, and lead to very little meaningful development in the countries where immigrants are leaving from, the origin countries, as they're called in this book. A figure provided on page 8 of the book shows that the 10 leading remittance receiving countries are among 10 of the poorest countries in the entire world, which is undeniable proof that migrant labor and remittances are not developing countries in the global South and are not bringing them out of poverty, which is something that's rarely, if ever, taken into account or even mentioned by neoliberal economists that have been defending migrant labor on behalf of the capitalist ruling class since the 1990s, as this book details. Additionally, community and family ties are broken when migrant laborers leave their family to work in wealthier countries and send remittances home. And they only do this in response to great poverty and degradation, and looking for a way to earn more money for their families, which as Marxists we know is them looking for more means of subsistence, looking for more means of survival. Of course, we can't have a comprehensive discussion about migrant labor without considering the xenophobia that's often directed towards migrant laborers by natural citizens of the destination country, and the way that migrant laborers are scapegoated by political ideologues who use them to explain away the systemic problems of capitalism, redirecting people's anger away from the capitalist ruling class and towards migrant workers who have no power in the capitalist system. Dr. Ness says in his introduction that migrant laborers in rich countries of the global north and south cope with a paradox of being both essential workers and social pariahs who are expendable and replaceable when socioeconomic demand for their labor expands. Migrant laborers are essential to maintaining the neoliberal capitalist mode of production, but they are the first to be blamed when that system starts to collapse or leaves large sections of the population behind. The population of migrant laborers are a vital section of the proletariat, and thus, as Marxists, it's important that we understand their role in the broader global economy, both in terms of how it affects the country of origin and the country of destination. With this book, Professor Ness has provided a fantastic analysis of this specific subject. As Noah said earlier, I see it as a tool, and I can't wait to dive deeper into the text. And it's already given me some ideas for short form video content, which is kind of my specialty, that I plan to use to promote this work, to promote the book and teach people about the vital concepts in the book. So thank you so much, Professor Ness, for publishing this awesome book and joining us for the book launch.
Thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank Carlos, Danny, Noah, and Eddie. So you've all really touched on very important points. I can go through each of them. I just want to start with this one extremely crucial issue that migrants are really the subject of blame, and they are treated as you pointed out, pariahs. And I would argue that liberals, as well as conservatives, are engaged in this process. We should not make a distinction between them. Liberals are calling it, whenever a migrant crosses the border, which they have every right to do, and when large numbers do, it's called a crisis that needs to be resolved. I don't use the term crisis at all. I think it should be banned because migrants are actually benefiting the capitalist class in the United States and other major countries and even poor countries. And they are essential to the extraction of surplus value and accumulation. But I wanted to make that point that migrants are not a problem. They're not part of any crisis. They are, in fact, helping everyone in the society. I really liked what Noah pointed out, the necessity of solidarity between migrant workers and those workers that are native born and so forth, that if you exploit migrant workers, it will hurt everyone. It will lower everyone's wages and allows the boss to use them as a scapegoat to politicians, especially, to also scapegoat them and treat them as the bogeyman who's causing the problems of the nation. Migrant workers are actually helping Western countries and rich countries, and they're not hurting them, they're actually helping them. And I really fear for countries like North Korea. That's why I actually don't believe in a unified Korea. I'm very much concerned that they would become part of the capitalist world economy, because the workers would be exploited to a high degree. Another point I'd like to make is that we do have a history of socialism in this world, and we should not negate it at all, as many social democrats, liberals, and so forth, and most Marxists actually in many instances do. I just ran into an Albanian. I was actually waylaid at an airport for 25 hours. I'm not an ecological tourist at all. So anyway, and I ran into an Albanian who lived during the period of Enver Hoxha. Well, whatever you think of Enver Hoxha, I'm not a Hoxhaist, but I think he actually ran a very wonderful, a great society. That sounds so counterintuitive to most people, that, you know, that's like the poorest country in the world. The man told me, he was about 60 or so. He said the best years of his life were when Albania was a socialist, and the society was living in a cohesive manner. And you know, the disdain and the ridicule that Albania got from the West, he was telling me, it was outrageous, because in fact the bunkers that they built was to maintain a society of equality and so forth, and to it wasn't really to prevent other countries from entering, but it was to maintain a society of equality with all, you know. I mean, I can't say that I agree with everything. I'm not a Hoxhaist or anything like that, but I think it's a very good model for a society. And, you know, they did not have emigration. After the end of socialism, everything fell apart for Albania, and many of them, as Danny well knows, are working in New York City as building service workers at extremely low wages, sometimes working in industries that are very dangerous and so forth. I mean, we can go on and on. I also wanted to, you know, thank Noah again, who argues he's not an intellectual, but without question you are. That, you know, the point of war position is really important, and it's not in the book actually. So thank you for bringing that up. We really need to change minds, and you know, my view of Gramsci is not the Western Marxist view of Gramsci. It's the Gramsci who was the leader of the Communist Party of Italy, and who, you know, led the Red Years and so forth.
So the actual Marxist view of Gramsci.
Yeah, I not the Western Marxist view. So in any case, I mean, of course, you know, I mean, what the Western Marxists like to do is, you know, rest on their woes and how things cannot happen, but things have happened that are highly positive. And, you know, I would rather live in a society that, you know, everyone is equal and everyone has their needs met. I wouldn't mind riding a bike rather than a car or anything else, and live in a society where you have healthcare, housing, basic needs. You know, who needs consumer goods in some respect? One that is not, you know, based on patriarchy, one that is equivalent. I'm very concerned for Vietnam, to tell you the truth, which is also brought up. Vietnam has been forced by the World Bank and the IMF to privatize much of its economy. I think we have to support those people who oppose within the government. I mean, let's hope that they'll fight and resist this. I think this is Danny who pointed this out, that will resist the privatization efforts. Migration is an integral part of it, and it really contributes to the exploitation of particularly women, actually. And so, but I think that's a very important issue. You know, I thought that Carlos's points, you know, very rich philosophical arguments about, you know, the justice that is necessary in the world, and that the distortions that are created by capitalists to advance their own interests and so forth. There's no question about it. I was very happy that you put forward the argument that I didn't have a chance to put forward, that, you know, if there are 800 million migrants in the world, the book is not just on international migrants. There are 800 million migrants. If you want to say that each migrant has, you know, family members, and even be conservative about it, maybe 5 or something like that, but not extended families, because families are fairly large, that we're really looking at, you know, 40% of the world that is part of this process. And that doesn't include the people who are the recipients of the benefits that migrants produce. I also want to make a very important argument about the exploitation of women and care work. Women in their prime of their life are forced to work in domestic jobs, and I think it's tragic. Like I said, I met people who were, couldn't afford the trip back home because they didn't get paid enough money, who had to walk, spent the week at work, had to walk back to the settlement and so forth, just to see people. And we're in dire straits. It really does disrupt families. Eddie, thank you very much for your comments. I'm really impressed by Midwest Marx Institute, and would like to, support you in every way possible. With respect to this book itself, my view is always to look ahead, not behind. So for me, it's sort of behind, but I think it's very important to point out the primary thrust of the book is about a visceral opposition that's based on reality, it's honest, to capitalist imperialism. And I view capitalist imperialism as primarily generated by the West and the rich countries of the world. And I think, trying to figure out who mentioned Russia, I think that might have been Eddie. I'm not sure, but I actually do, or I know, but maybe Danny. I do consider Russia part of the global South. So does Samuel King and a number of other, if you take a look at their GDP per capita. We really have to not only struggle against liberals and conservatives, but also many people who call themselves Marxists. I want to make that point very clear. There are distinctions to be drawn. Some Marxists are living in dreamlands that don't exist. They're looking for, kind of millennial solutions to the future, which will never happen. We have to fight for socialism today, and we have to do so in ways that are unifying the working class and not dividing them. But I just wanted to thank everybody for their, very nice comments about the book, and are very positive comments. And I'm also willing to take criticism. So yeah. I mean, I would like to say that there are many migrants that are also climate migrants that are, the result of, we can go into a long discussion about it, that are a consequence of the incredible pollution that is produced by, and carbon use that's produced by the West. I think it's a misnomer to say that China is a leading producer. I thought that was outrageous, in fact, that they were singled out along with the United States, because China is a producer for the United States and Europe. All of Europe's 75–80% of their cars are produced in China. And so they get slammed with this idea that they're producing pollution. It's actually that they're producing commodities for the West. And that pollution is really the responsibility of Western capitalists. China's moving towards socialism, let's hope. And I think that is the case in many respects. So I wanted to make that point because I think it's very important. People talk about China being a polluter. The beneficiaries of that pollution are not Chinese people. They are Europeans and North Americans and so forth. So I just want to, there's so much more to say about it, but really the essential point is that migration is not a model for development. It is the most, I would say, monetized way in which the West can profit from individuals spending the best parts of their lives overseas and neglecting their own countries, but doing so because they have to. It's just for survival. And so I support every migrant that's in New York City today. I hope Danny does as well. Venezuelans, please come, as many as you can, to New York City. And that goes for all Central Americans and all other migrants. I think we should welcome them and with open arms. And that's what I want to say from a practical perspective. So I just wanted to finish there, and thank you for everyone for those really rich comments.
Thank you so much, Manny. And that's actually a good segue to an audience question. But first, I wanted to open up the floor if anyone else has comments, lingering questions, or if we should go directly. We have a good question on Venezuela from our friends at Orinoco.
I have one criticism, actually. The term Western Marxists, I don't let them have it. I don't. And I yell at Carlos all about this all the time. They're not Marxists. They're not using the worldview. They're not ascending to the concrete. They're utopians at best, in my opinion, anyway. Kind of a funny critique.
Accepted.
But yeah, any comments from the panel before we switch to some of the questions here? We have some good questions. So our friends from Orinoco Tribune, who have co-sponsored this terrific event, say we understand, and this is a Venezuelan-based group, by the way. We understand the book focus on financial imperialism and migration. We wonder if Professor Ness has a position on the political use of migration as a destabilization tool, like in Cuba, Venezuela, or many of the other, or I don't know if the comment in the, yeah, I'm guessing many of the other socialist countries in Latin America.
Yeah, I mean, we are very well aware of the blockade of Cuba and the tremendous amounts of sanctions that are placed on Venezuela and had been extended and enforced to turn Venezuela into a place where there's far more need and poverty, and essential goods are prevented from entering the country. So I view actually there is there is a class struggle that's going on in Venezuela. I mean, we have to read the Communist Manifesto that we always constantly have to fight the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and that those people who are coming to the United States who are working class, we have to completely support. I don't support those Venezuelans who come to the United States who are critics of the really noble socialist effort that was started under Hugo Chavez and the people of Venezuela. So I think sanctions is a project also of the West, just as migration is, and we must oppose sanctions on these countries that are trying to develop on their own path. And you know, if you talk to people from Cuba, Venezuela, etc., who are really really care about their countries, they're saying we just want to live in peace. Let us develop our own society. I mean, you know, you want to fight in the United States, you can have your own class struggles, but just stay out of our country. And I think that's really the answer, and leave us alone and stop the blockades and the sanctions against these countries and these governments. We should never, ever call these countries regimes. The United States is a regime, as far as I'm concerned.
Beautifully said. And this is an issue that, for me as a Cuban, always hits home, because a lot of a good chunk of the Cuban migrants are instrumentalized in many ways by empire in order to craft the narrative against Cuba. And you know, it's very sad to see, because they're playing the role that Jose Marti calls gusanos de corbata, you know, worms in bow ties, which is where the slur gusanos comes from. It comes from Marti, as most of the great images in Cuba do. But you know, I always saw this with specifically what they call los parceros, the people that come on rafts, and there's so much context that's ignored. Like what are the forces that push people into those conditions, right? How does the the hybrid warfare, 60-year-long hybrid warfare on Cuba, lead to desperation within Cuba. There's so many factors that are left out, and a big chunk of my work revolves around this. But the ways in which the Cuban people are not allowed because of the U.S. to, if they want to leave the country, to do so by like airplanes or regular forms of travel. It's the U.S. that forces these horrific forms of migration after it has created difficult material conditions through blockades on people, so that then the cameras come out and they can point at the balseros and say, people hate socialism so much they jump on rafts in order to get to good old USA. And it's bullshit. It's bullshit. The only reason why they're forced to do that is because of the pressures that the US puts on Cuba and the limitations that the US sets on the people that want to leave, to be able to leave by more rational needs. And they definitely use that as a form of atrocity propaganda against socialism and against Cuba, which is a lighthouse of hope, and has always been a lighthouse of hope for humanity, especially after the 90s, where only Cuba and the DPRK were left basically for humanity to look up to. But I'll pass it up to
I
the
can
panel.
jump in. I'll jump in too on Venezuela. Very similar to what Carlos is saying with the atrocity propaganda. The New York Times can never resist the opportunity to showcase this or that hospital that's in decay in Maracaibo or in Caracas. Well, why is it in decay? A nation of 30 million people that have been subjected since the Obama regime in 2014 to the most airtight economic war and sanctions. The official number that imperialism gives is that 7.5 million Venezuelans have fled their Chavista homeland, their Bolivarian homeland. Massive Venezuelan communities have gone to the Dominican Republic, to Chile, of course, here to New York City and to Miami. And we have to understand that this forced migration, as Carlos has laid out and as Manny lays out in his book, this is an essential part of the battle of ideas, which Fidel called the most important battle of all, because every time that there's an immigrant, that there's a migrant from Venezuela or Nicaragua or Bolivia or Zimbabwe or Cuba, CNN wants to showcase that. Well, and that's the first thing that we hear at our workplaces and from our family members.
My God.
Oh, it's so painful. Noah was giving different examples of those workplace conversations. I'm in Venezuela on average once, twice, maybe even 3 times a year. And I'll return and I'll see my family members, half of whom are addicted to Fox and One American Network, and the other half are addicted to MSNBC and CNN. It's really a debate which is more poisonous. I think they're equally venomous. But you'd think they'd have some humility and say, well, Danny, how'd it go? How's Venezuela? What did you see? When I walk in that door for whether it's Christmas Eve or a birthday party, they're lecturing me on Venezuela. They don't have the humility just to engage in a conversation. Yeah. So truly, it is difficult. We were talking about this last night in our Reform or Revolution, a Marxist view of revolutions past class. The 8 to 10 is the official class, but then, once we cut the recording, 10 p.m. to who knows when, I think our record at this point is about 2 a.m. But I tell them that's when the real class starts. And we were having these very candid conversations about the wars on the Venezuelan people, on the Cuban people. And I think it's important too, a lot of Chavistas are also under attack within Venezuela. The right wing have their own police. The right wing have their own petty bourgeois enclaves. There's schools in Venezuela where if they suspect that you're a Chavista, you'll be fired. You'll never be hired. So the war on Venezuela is a multifaceted shadow or hybrid war. So I saw the interview you did as well, Manny. I forget, Carlos, where the interview was that Manny did, but you spoke very eloquently in defense of Venezuela, where the class struggle, as you said, is sharper than ever.
What I'm trying to do a book on Venezuela right now, and one of the things that I've noticed is the U.S. dumps a whole bunch of money into Colombia to set up Western banking institutions, but then to also set up programs to lure skilled workers out of Venezuela to do anything that they can to weaken their economy, which is why we like the sort of concept that Vijay Prashad uses, hybrid war, to describe what they do, because they just attack these socialist countries from every direction.
Yeah, that's the exact same thing they did to East Germany, by the way. But I want to sort of jump in on the conversations with coworkers and families thing, because this is exactly, you'll hear this a million times, and there's a very easy way to answer it, at least in my experience, when they're like, well, communism or socialism or whatever has to be horrible. Look at all these people fleeing there to come here. And what works for me with dozens of coworkers is, what will make you leave your home, right? And you talk about the bad conditions, and you tell them, like, let's actually think about that. What directly causes this, right? Like, we can look up cause and effect, what policies, whatever you want to look at. And when you actually do that, they start thinking on a less abstract and more concrete level. And the real reason is imperialism. It's the hybrid warfare that Eddie just mentioned that is the perfect term for it. And to a man, every single person that I had this conversation with is on board now. They get it now. It just takes a minute sometimes. But this is one of the best ways to begin bringing people around.
By the way, thank you so much, Pinay Yonsei, for the 1946, sending 1946 to recognize Filipino independence from the U.S. Today, the Filipino primary exports is labor. Yes, thank you very much. It's also the 90th anniversary of the birth of Zamora Machel, the great legendary Marxist-Leninist revolutionary Mozambican. So it's a great day today.
Assassinated too.
Yeah.
It's also my mother-in-law's birthday, though. I guess that's not as important.
The important things.
Although I have a very funny story that we can get into off air.
Manny, I had one question, because it's you touched on Nepal and the migrant laborers from Nepal going to England, specifically after Brexit. And I remember that one of the some comrades in England that were in favor of Brexit, people have been very consistent anti-imperialists their whole lives, people like George Galloway. One of the arguments was this thing where, being within the European Union, you have cheap labor that can be brought in from different countries, and it damages the capacity for British workers to fight for certain demands. But I feel like what that argument ignores is that there's still the structural necessity for that very cheap, super exploitable worker, and it was going to be found somewhere else. If they weren't going to be able to bring them from another part of the EU, they're going to do what they're doing now, which is bringing them from Nepal. So can you talk a little bit about that? Was that something that you saw coming in their arguments?
Well, I think it's a very good point you're making, Carlos. The European migration system is based on the Schengen zone, where mainly rich European countries, but some poorer countries like Romania, which is a member of the Schengen zone, send migrant workers to England. And the point is, by leaving this zone where there's some very significant problems with respect to the fact that Africans and Middle Eastern migrants are not allowed, and so many thousands die every year trying to cross the Mediterranean and so forth because of the Frontex project, which prevents people from migrating. There's a severe surveillance system that's in place both in North America. It's not just Trump. This is why I say it's not just there's a lot of conservatism and reactionary politics in Europe as well. It's not just the United States. Meloni in Italy and so forth, she got elected on the basis of stopping migration. It's a very important issue. But when you just to answer your question, now Britain is able to take advantage of even lower wage workers, not European workers who may demand higher wages, but really exploit workers from the global south, third world, and so forth. And Nepalese workers, the stories of migration and working in the fishing industry, and many of them dying and never coming back home. Lives are expendable for those people in the global south, as opposed to I have to be honest, as opposed to the north. There is a higher level of expendability. We have to unify working class people, no question about it. We have to build internationalism. This is really one of the major themes of the book. How do we build internationalism and support migrant workers and their families back home and the countries back home? And that's what I'm fighting for every day. I have to be very honest with you about that. It's a struggle. Danny knows we're doing it. I mean, we're trying to do that. I am anyway, trying to build something with whomever wants to work on some of these projects. And we're making some headway. I'm just saying comrades and so forth in trying to build an opposition. The notion of the politics of ideas, the struggle over ideas is very crucial. So our forms of solidarity has to be around that. There was a question about Venezuela, which I missed. I don't know who wanted to answer it. I wanted to emphasize the point that, there's class struggles that exist everywhere. And the struggle for socialism is not something that stops. It is continuous over time. And you can't stop fighting for socialism, even after you've achieved it, because there's always the bourgeois elements that might, under capitalism, because it still exists, that will try to intercede and overturn. And that's basically the issue with respect to Venezuela. So, Venezuela is under siege. I think that's as simple as that. And supported by many bourgeois Venezuelans in the United States.
Yeah, and by some on the fake left in the U.S. But it wasn't a question. It was a really nice comment from Jesus Alfonso. They say I'm from Venezuela and I belong to an organization called Communard Union. We work in Venezuelan communes as our place of class struggle. I'm really grateful for you, with you, for your work. Thank you so much, Jesus. I had a question I wanted to ask Manny, but I don't want to monopolize all of the questions we asked Manny. So if anyone else has something that they want to ask or comment on, please feel free to go ahead and do that. It is getting late, though. We're at an hour 47 mark, but
you want to ask your question, have that be the last one then, Carlos?
Sure, yeah. Well, it kind of goes back to one of the focuses that Danny teased out from your book, Manny, and that's the notion of cultural imperialism. And it's something that's very rampant. The other day I saw a video on TikTok that was absolutely disgusting. I think it was Japan or something, but they were interviewing women about white men. And a lot of them were saying that they wouldn't date white men because they're so beautiful, they're almost godlike. And that idea, the aesthetic standard of beauty and its connections to like the forms of white beauty or something, was something that it was revulsive, and it's a form of cultural imperialism. But connected to that, one of the issues that we've taken notice of in
Real
terms
quick,
of
Carlos, I want to interrupt you and just say they clearly have never been to the Midwest.
Yeah, we got some busted white dudes in the Midwest. Yeah, they're not all the ones in the movies, your Brad Pitts and stuff. But
Oh, God.
y-
Keep them
one
away.
of one of the one of the things we focused on in the institute, and that we've considered as indispensable in this war of positions, is the ability to combat what I consider to be the most advanced wing of bourgeois ideology today, which is the liberal wing, and
Yeah.
it's participated in a form of cultural imperialism that we've been calling for a while now woke imperialism. And I know there's some people that don't like that term. We vehemently reject the way that the right uses it, and our slogan has sometimes been be anti woke in the sense of oppose the way that the right uses it, but also be anti woke in the sense of opposing the way that the liberal wing of empire uses wokeism. The elite use wokeism in order to get to their agendas, and I think it has become an indispensable component for achieving consent in imperialist attacks of countries outside of the spheres of influence of empire, both socialist and not in character. I saw this. We covered very closely the July 11th uprisings in Cuba in 2021, and the narrative around that was, oh, they're oppressing black artists, and then if you cover the liberal narrative used to justify these hybrid warfare attacks against Venezuela, they emphasize attacks on LGBTQ people. They do the same thing with Russia. When they talk about China, the biggest story of the last 2-3 years has been the so-called Uyghur genocide that's baseless. There's no evidence for. They've admitted eventually that there's no evidence for, but the way that they always speak about it, the language at play is Uyghur Muslim minority. That's always thrown in there. They do the same thing with Iran, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems to me that because a lot of the struggles that we've waged, you have the political revolution in 1964, and and in some ways the consciousness of the American people has changed. A lot of them are attuned to the struggles of minorities and marginalized groups, and the liberal wing of the elite realizes that in order to succeed in its conquest, that whole old stuff of these people are uncivilized and we have to go get them, it doesn't really work anymore for a large chunk of the population. It needs to it needs to wrap it in a woke garb, something that resembles the struggles that people here wage in favor of the rights of oppressed peoples and marginalized groups. So do you see that? Do you see that as a part of cultural imperialism? How would you conceptualize that phenomenon of wrapping these wars against peoples fighting for sovereignty outside of the spheres of influence of empire, wrapping them in this pseudo-progressive veneer of defending LGBTQ or minority rights or whatever?
Well, I think we should turn that on its head. I think we need to have wokeness in the United States, because you go to Cuba, their families are far more woke than the United States in terms of their definition of families. And by the way, that's not anything new necessarily. In Cuba, people are free to do what they want. I also think that the CIA has a very big role to play in it as well, because they sponsor many of these woke groups, which are in many cases false. In the case of China, for instance, you mentioned the Uyghurs. China has a nationality policy with 52 different nations. And, of course, there's always room for improvement. We don't believe in purity, right? So, but the United States doesn't have that kind of system. And, I really respect China for allowing, and this is something that the Soviet Union tried to achieve and did to some extent, to have a a nation of many peoples. So, I mean, the idea, I mean, I don't want to get into the question of the Uyghurs. It's offensive, to tell you the truth, in terms of even addressing it, because we're basically being pushed by the CIA to respond to liberal arguments. And I'm sorry, I have been exposed to that far too many times. And if people should go visit Xinjiang province and see how people are treated. So I think that the whole idea, even labor, the idea of trade unions and so forth, we care about workers and strikes and so forth. The disdain that the CIA and liberals have for unions in the global south, as well as China. I'm actually working on a book. It's about the ACFTU, which I think is the epitome of democracy, which allows workers, every single worker, the democratic right to be a member. I mean, can you imagine the United States allowing every worker to be a member of the union? And the union of the way they want to establish it, grassroots-based unions. But we're fed lies every day. Danny put it forward. I don't watch television. I mean, it's sickening. To be honest with you, I'm not going to be mince words at all. So I feel a lot better. It's because I don't have to be exposed to that garbage. And I think most of your listeners probably agree and probably don't buy into this. And if they do, they should stop. It's actually a very important lesson that we should really struggle against the cultural imperialism, which is found in the so-called news. I don't like to use the term so-called self-proclaimed news, which is not news at all. And, I just, I'm trying to deprogram students. I have to be very careful. But, essentially what we're engaged in as academics, I'm a worker in some ways, yeah. What we're trying to do, I think all of us, is try to program people. So all the propaganda that students have learned, including myself at various times, we have to rid ourselves of, and that's my objective, and a very important one. I think those of us, and everyone here is a teacher in our own ways. Everyone, I mean, I learned from every one of you that my main thing is to try to teach people, students, the truth, not propaganda. But it's very hard, considering the, going back to Gramsci, the war position that where the ideas are dominated by the ruling class. Actually, go back to the German ideology, where that's basically the major point. The capitalist class controls the ideas, and liberals play a major role in that. So I think I think the German ideology itself is the most important text on that subject, and it's so clearly written and so beautifully written.
One of the greatest texts of all time. You can't understand capital until you understand the German ideology.
And now that's something that the Western Marxists are trying to take away from us as well, making all these BS arguments that it wasn't actually a book.
The Western what's, Carlos?
Well, I'll do, every time I say it, I'll put quotations, air quotations. But
Right.
Manny, this has been a tremendous pleasure, tremendously insightful. We've learned so much from you, and this book is a must-have, folks. So we've put it in the chat a few times. I'm going to go ahead and put it again.
I want to say your book is a must-have book as well, which we've had reading groups. Your book on the purity fetish, and we're continuing to do that. And here in New York City, Danny, were you part of that? I think so.
I was in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, but I helped to organize it for sure.
Right, that's right. Yeah. So, and we're going to continue that, and we're also going to have a protest against NATO and the war. I hope Danny comes in New York in front of what used to be called the Time Warner Center, now is Deutsche Bank Center, the Columbus Circle. And it's all left groups are coming. So we have to fight against NATO. It's a very severe issue. That's another subject altogether. So, but thank you very much for having me. I hope to work with you in the future, and this has been, I've learned so much from you as well. So you didn't throw me softball questions. They were very interesting questions.
Is there anything you'd like to plug? Where can people find your work?
The book isn't expensive. It's paperback. Yeah, it's a paperback book, and you can find it. I hate to say it, on Amazon. I really hate to say it, but yeah, it's available on Amazon. It's available in bookstores probably. And if you want to review the book, you get a free copy. So, whichever one of you did. So, but anyway, yeah. So, yeah. Thank you for plugging the book. I appreciate that. Mainly because I think these ideas need to be transmitted to greater numbers of people. That's the only concern I have. None other.
Absolutely. Well, that's a beautiful way to go about ending it. But before we go, Comrade Danny has a beautiful poem that he would like to read in dedication of Samora Machel. So please go ahead, Danny, and then we'll sign out with the International right after.
365 days of resistance. We stand on the shoulders of giants. I wrote tributes on the days that our revolutionary heroes were cut down. I wrote tributes, not on their birthdays, but on the days when they were murdered. In the case of Samora Machel, they hijacked and blew up his plane. Apartheid hijacked sovereignty's plane in dream, a communal ancestral dream. But his deepest wound escaped a warped heaven's harsh judgment, trespassing violent vistas, vehement visas, barbarous borders, border wars, reciting hymns of combat into the memory of future centuries. That's the end of the poem.
Beautiful. Thank you all for watching. Thank you, Danny, for that poem. Thank you, Manny, for being here. And thank you to everyone else for participating and providing insightful comments. It was a pleasure. We'll have to have you on again sometime soon. And we'll see you next time. We'll go out the same way we came in with the glorious International. See you, folks.
injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.